Let's get a check now of the top business news stories. Kate Moody is here. Good evening to you, Kate.
Hi, Tom.
Now, the US President Joe Biden preparing to address one of the issues that's been really highlighted during this pandemic, which is, of course, that global supply chains are extremely fragile.
Yeah, and he's going to be signing an executive order shortly, which will launch a review of a number of industries in which he thinks the US may be too dependent on other countries. Among them, semiconductors, the majority of which are currently produced in Asia, large capacity batteries like those that are used in electric vehicles, pharmaceuticals, drug ingredients and medical supplies, and rare earths and minerals. The review will determine the risks in each area and could push American companies to relocate their suppliers either to the US or to countries which are seen as closer allies. The text is not expected to specifically name China, but its dominance in many of those areas is clearly being targeted. One administration official said the move wasn't about making everything in America, but about promoting resilient supply chains. A number of industries are currently grappling with a shortage of computer chips in particular. That's prompted car makers around the world to slow their production. And Sony has even today warned it could impact supplies of its PlayStation 5 console this year. The U.S. Federal Aviation Administration has ordered airlines not to fly planes with certain Pratt & Whitney engines until they've been checked. That's after this weekend's incident in which a Boeing 777 jet suffered an engine failure minutes after takeoff and showered metal parts across a neighborhood in Colorado. Yinka Oyatade has the story.
Over 100 Boeing planes now out of action. This after America's Federal Aviation Administration ordered that planes carrying a PW4000 engine be grounded, pending further checks. The move comes after a weekend scare when an engine on a United Airlines flight caught fire, raining debris down on a suburb of Denver. The plane landed safely, but regulators say aircraft with this particular engine must undergo inspection before being allowed back in the skies.
We want to understand what happened and then take the necessary steps to prevent a similar occurrence in the future.
The affected engine is used in older Boeing planes, flown only by a handful of airlines in the United States, Japan and South Korea. But it's not the first time that the manufacturer, Pratt & Whitney, has had problems with this model. In 2018, the same engine failed on a United flight to Hawaii and again during a Japan Airlines flight last December. The company says it will now carry out the extra checks for airlines.
Pratt & Whitney powers approximately 125 Boeing 777 aircraft with its PW4000-112 engine. Pratt & Whitney is coordinating all actions with Boeing, airline operators and regulators. The safe operation of the fleet is our top priority.
Although it's the engine which is the source of these problems, the timing isn't good for Boeing either. The airplane maker had just resumed deliveries of its 737 MAX jets, which were grounded for over 18 months following 2 deadly crashes.
Let's check in on the day's trading action now. The major European indices closed higher. The DAX up about 0.8 of a percentage point. Shares of the French hotel group Accor, meanwhile, rose nearly 3% in Paris, despite reporting net losses of almost 2 billion euros last year. Wall Street is trending higher. Boeing shares have jumped around 7% as it recovers from that engine failure scare this weekend. Shares of Johnson & Johnson are up 2% after U.S. regulators took a step towards approving its COVID-19 vaccine for distribution. A day after agreeing to allow Australian users to access news again, Facebook has pledged to match Google's billion-dollar budget for news content. Last week, the social media giant blocked news stories in Australia in protest over a draft law which would force online giants to pay publishers whose work is featured on their platforms. Google, while also pushing back at the legislation, has been brokering deals with media outlets. In a blog post on Wednesday, Facebook said it was in active negotiations with news companies in France and Germany, among others, but it defended its own move in Australia, saying again it was the result of a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship it has with news publishers. Moving on to some of the day's other business headlines now. The European Commission has opened a public consultation on gig economy workers. Trade unions and employers groups will be asked whether there should be changes for the growing number of people working for platforms like Uber and Deliveroo. Spain and the UK have recently ruled in specific cases that they should be treated as employees and not independent workers. And prosecutors in Italy this Wednesday have fined 4 food delivery platforms €730 million for breaching safety labor rules. The South African government has announced a budget which will include more than 500 million euros to vaccinate 2/3 of the population. The budget was unveiled a day after data showed unemployment had hit 30% and 60% among young people. The spending plan did not include an expected tax hike. And London's Heathrow Airport lost more than 2 billion euros last year as the pandemic pushed passenger numbers to their lowest levels since the 1970s. The number of people using the airport fell by 73% in 2020. Well, the pandemic has hit the fortunes of planes, trains, and automobiles. France's National Rail Service, the SNCF, says it lost 3 billion euros last year, and it warns these ongoing restrictions could hamper its recovery. Marius Sophos has more.
A practically empty train heading to Dunkirk. Ticket sales for the school holiday period are down by 40% compared to the same time last year. France's national rail company SNCF is operating a reduced timetable, with only 3 out of 4 of its high-speed TGV trains running.
I was taking the train before and there were a lot of people, but now there are far fewer. I think people are being more careful. Perhaps they're moving around less.
I usually take the earlier train, and so it's busier. Today I'm taking a later train, the 2103, and there are very few people. I'm a bit surprised.
Deserted trains and empty stations. It's less than a year since France's first lockdown, when at their lowest level of service, TGV trains were carrying 1% their normal level of passengers. 3,500 trains were running per day compared to the usual 15,000. In summer, following the lockdown, train stations resumed service and travellers streamed in, a breath of fresh air for SNCF after coming to a relative standstill. Then in autumn, a second lockdown was imposed, adding to an already gloomy outlook for the rail company. In total, in 2020, the number of passengers fell by 42%. For SNCF, it's unprecedented.
SNCF needs to prepare for resumed service and renewed demands, at least for holiday travellers. To do this, it needs to support its drivers and support its staff, even if it costs money today, because the trains are empty. In the mid-term, it needs to shift its focus to holiday travel.
While SNCF has received massive support from the French government, in 2020 the company had a net loss of 3 billion euros.
The International Air Transport Association has downgraded its forecast for a recovery this year. It says airlines are on track to lose between $75 and $95 billion in 2021. That's nearly double the $48 billion it previously forecast, but well short of the $150 billion in losses last year. While demand is unlikely to rebound fully until the pandemic is brought under control and restrictions are lifted, IATA is hoping that technology can play a role in restarting air travel. It's preparing to launch an app which will standardize COVID test and vaccination records. Heathrow has said it takes some passengers up to 20 minutes to organize their paperwork while checking in. Dozens of airlines will begin trials of that digital travel pass in the coming weeks. And of course, a lot of questions about the modalities of how this is really going to work. But IATA, for one, and a lot of airlines say that this is really just going to help streamline the process and make it easier for people to travel again once they're ready to do so.
Okay, well, I think we're all ready to travel, aren't we? Thank you very much indeed. Our business editor, Kate Moody.